Alright, hello, and welcome to Adventures Among Ideas, bringing you inspiring instances from the history of intellection. Today I'm continuing with the limits of pluralism debate, the penultimate episode this is of this little mini series on literary interpretation. So get ready and buckle up. The first three episodes that I did for this, I discussed Wayne Booth, M.H. Abrams, and J. Hillis Miller. They published their first three contributions to this debate in the spring of 1977, which I realized was how many years ago? 45 years ago, I believe. In Critical Inquiry, the famous journal Critical Inquiry. And then in the summer of 1977, so kind of the first publications, official kind of publications, were in the spring of 1977. In the summer of 1977, two more contributions were published, one by James Kincaid and one by Morse Peckham. Both Kincaid and Peckham tried to mediate in different ways, in certain ways, between the Chicago neo-Aristotelians, such as Wayne Booth, and the historicists, such as Abrams, on the one hand, so they're kind of traditional in different ways on the one hand, and then on the other hand you had the deconstructionists like J. Hillis Miller and Kincaid and Peckham were in different ways trying to mediate between these two groups, kind of traditional and non-traditional literary critics. So Kincaid, today we're talking about James Kincaid. Kincaid's essay was called Coherent Readers, Incoherent Texts. In my humble opinion, it's maybe the weakest entry in the debate in terms of its argument, but it's worth discussing anyway because it brings up some important points, I think. So who is Kincaid? Actually, I don't really know too much about him. I looked him up, but I just know really his work. I don't know very much about him personally, but I believe he's still an English professor at the University of Southern California, as far as I could tell. Mainly a specialist in Victorian literature. He's written a bunch of stuff about Victorian literature and also about the sexualization of children in kind of popular culture. So an interesting work, but I don't know too much about him. And I don't know if he had spent too much time at this time of his life wading into theoretical issues, so that may account for some of the weaknesses here. I don't really mean any disrespect by saying that. This was, of course, 45 years ago. In his article, so going into the article, Kincaid says that he wants to find a middle ground, quote unquote, find a middle ground that is perhaps not satisfactory to any of the parties to the debate, but which incorporates some freedom and some solidity of meaning. So he wants to give some freedom of meaning, but also some kind of solid center of meaning as well. Kincaid says that Booth and Abrams are basically right about readers, or about the activity of reading, and that Miller is more right about texts and language, per se. Readers, Kincaid says, try to construct a unity or coherence out of what they read. So it's the activity of the readers that is creating or trying to create coherence, but the text itself, or at least many of the texts that we find to be most interesting, present incoherence. So again, coherent readers, incoherent texts. This seems to be related to a principle of a certain kind of perception theory. The world, according to this theory, presents us with chaos or a disorder, and the purpose of our perceptual apparatus is to make some kind of sense out of it, to put it in some kind of order on which we can act. Kincaid does, as a matter of fact, briefly mention this type of theory, but it's not a really big major component of his article. So Kincaid's basic argument is that, and I'm going to quote him, most texts are, in fact, demonstrably incoherent, presenting us not only with multiple organizing patterns, but with organizing patterns that are competing, logically inconsistent. So the text is made up of patterns that don't fit together logically. Now, Kincaid mainly focuses on novels or genres of novels. Sometimes he seems to be talking about themes rather than genres, but in any case, his work is certainly, I think, made easier by focusing on the novel, because the novel is a famously complex genre of literature, especially in the analysis of someone like Mikhail Bakhtin, the great Russian literary theorist, and others have said similar things. The novel is almost by definition an incoherent genre. So characters talk in different ways. There's different narratives going on, one after the other, or kind of at the same time. Different settings may be involved. There may be bits of poetry or song mixed in with the prose. There's dialogue mixed in with just description. So it's all kinds of stuff happening in novels usually, even fairly mainstream, kind of straightforward novels. There's lots of different things going on. So I think it's always been a challenge to find coherency in the novel. So I think his task of showing how literature is incoherent is maybe made too easy by the choice of genre. Anyway, to illustrate what he means by incoherent, so what does incoherent mean? Kincaid uses the famous duck-rabbit image, ambiguous image. You've probably seen this before. If you look at it one way, the figure, it's a drawing. If you look at it one way, it looks like a duck. If you look at it the other way, it looks like a rabbit. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein made it especially famous, though he wasn't the first person to use it. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, you can Google duck-rabbit ambiguous image. But you'll probably recognize it when you see it. When you look at the image, you see either a duck or a rabbit, right? So you might flicker back and forth between seeing a duck and seeing a rabbit. But anyway, you can't see both a duck and a rabbit at the same time. It seems to be impossible in principle to see both at the same time, although you might see different ones in quick succession. There's no single coherent figure, in other words, and one figure cannot be subordinated to the other. So the duck is not just kind of a funny kind of rabbit. The rabbit is not a funny kind of a duck or something. So it's not mainly one thing or the other thing. It's both things at the same time, but we can only see one or the other at any one instant. Anyway, so Cade tries to demonstrate that literary texts, or at least novels, do the same thing. They present different patterns that can't be reconciled or fit together into one unified, coherent thing. A novel presents us with a variety of details and themes and narrative arcs and characters and so on. And we try, so Kincaid says, to make a consistent experience out of this. But what we might call our will to coherency is constantly frustrated or thwarted by the actual text. Kincaid gives a number of examples. I just want to mention one, just to give the flavor of his procedure here in this article. I'll give the example of Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Wuthering Heights, Kincaid says, can be read as a romance, a tragedy, a comedy, or an irony. And here Kincaid is following Northrop Frye's 4 narrative patterns found in literature. This was big at the time. So in one way of looking at the book for Kincaid, it's a romance with Gothic elements. And I should say if you look at the article, I find it very unclear what Kincaid means by romance. I mean, there's different understandings of the term romance in literary theory. So Kincaid doesn't give a really clear picture of what he means. Doesn't seem to be exactly using Northrop Frye's definition. Kincaid says something about the novel's tendency to abstract, to universalize, and to establish absolute rather than relative or socially determined standards of judgment. I'm not really sure. When I read the novel, I don't know if I see that. But, so I'm not quite sure what he's talking about here, or why why romance in this sense, whatever that is, would necessarily conflict with tragedy or irony, or whatever else. But anyway, moving on. In another way, the book is a tragedy. On this reading, the intense and disastrous relationship between Heathcliff and Cathy is emphasized, the older Cathy. And in yet another way, the book is a comedy. In this case, the narrative of Hareton and Kathy Linton is emphasized more, and also maybe the Lockwood story, the Lockwood narrative arc. And finally, the book is an irony, Kincaid says. In this case, we would focus especially on the character of Nellie. Now, Nellie doesn't exactly draw our most intense interest in the book and is kind of obtuse, kind of this common folk character. But in another sense, she's the dominant character. She goes really from beginning to end, or for most of the book anyway, and is kind of the winner of the story in a sense. She outlasts everyone, or at least she's kind of there at the end, as Kincaid says, babbling on, or whatever he says at the end. So she's kind of the winner. But are these points of view really incoherent with each other? Can we not see the novel as both a tragedy and a comedy, as a romance and an irony? Do these things not fit together? Kincaid claims that no, they don't. We can't see them as all these things. At least we can't see them as all these things in the same way that we can't see the duck-rabbit image as both a rabbit and a duck at the same time. So he says these narrative patterns are defined in opposition to each other, and that makes the text incoherent. When we read the novel, we respond to all of them, to all of these different narrative patterns, or at least we can respond to all of these different narrative patterns, but we're not able to actually unify these patterns of romance, tragedy, comedy, and irony into something higher, into a higher, more embracing unity. As Kincaid says, describing the book, there is a romance which develops incoherently into a tragedy, the Heathcliff Cathy Earnshaw story, and there is an irony which develops incoherently into a comedy, the Hareton Cathy Linton story, supported vigorously by Nellie Dean. And these two patterns of romance into tragedy and irony into comedy, which Kincaid claims are themselves incoherently developed, directly conflict with each other. So apparently the romance into tragedy and the irony into comedy directly conflict with each other. Do they? I don't know. This is not exactly what Fry would claim. I think in Fry's theory, tragedy and comedy do formally conflict with each other, and romance and irony conflict with each other. So there is a sense in which, yes, the Heathcliff Cathy story and the Hareton Cathy story conflict with each other. But is romance incoherent with tragedy, and is irony incoherent with comedy? This is not something that Fry says, I think. He says, in fact, that they blend together. So romance and irony, kind of on separate terms, can be either tragic or comic. Romance and tragedy blend together. Irony and tragedy can blend together, and so on. So yeah, I'm not sure if what Kincaid is saying here makes total sense. I guess it depends on how you're going to define things. But it doesn't seem to me that there is a necessary conflict between the various narrative patterns in Wuthering Heights. I think it just depends on how you define the patterns. If you define them as conflicting, then, well, they conflict. If you define them as part of a whole, then maybe for you they cohere. On the other hand, so there's another way maybe of looking at what he's saying here, and maybe reinterpreting what he's saying here. I think you could argue that the conflict is not in the text. So the incoherence is not per se in the text, but in the reader's experience. And this kind of subverts what Kincaid is trying to say. But we can feel horrified or saddened or whatever at the Heathcliff Cathy Earnshaw story arc, and we can feel delighted or laugh or whatever at the Hareton Cathy Linton arc, but we can't do both at the same time, right? So our responses conflict. We have one response during one scene or one event or one part of one narrative, and a different kind of response at a different part of the other narrative. So You could also argue, kind of contra Kincaid, that the text is coherent or maybe undecided, and the reader is incoherent. The experiences of the reader are just incoherent. And this maybe matches more with our real lives, in which we go through life experiencing things that, having experiences that can't be easily put together into a whole, but we try to do that maybe with our personality, or when we talk about self and things like that. We're trying to make a unity out of our diverse and divergent and eclectic experiences. So yeah, maybe. Anyway, I don't think Kincaid very successfully mediates between the Booth-Abrams position and the Miller deconstructionist position, but he does raise some interesting issues, as I said, and it gives me at least a reason to revisit Wuthering Heights, which is kind of a standard in discussions of literary criticism. So it's a good book to know. All right, I should also mention that Kincaid's article was responded to by the Fry scholar Robert Denham, who made some criticisms, which I brought up some of his criticisms already, about his maybe misreading or misuse of Fry's theory. Denham's article was, that's Denham, not quite like my name, in an article called The No Man's Land of Competing Patterns. And then Kincaid responded to this, to that article, in another article called Pluralistic Monism. So I've incorporated some of the ideas from that exchange already in my earlier discussion. So I think, well, I'll mention also that I think Kincaid might have done better to draw on Morse Peckham's writings, who I'll talk about next time. I'll talk about Morse Peckham next time. But Morse Peckham had these a series of writings in the 1960s on aesthetic discontinuity, and this Kincaid might have found these helpful. Perhaps he did not know about them. In those writings, in Peckham's writings on aesthetic discontinuity, Peckham argued that there are 4 kinds of discontinuity or incoherence present in art. He calls these internal, external, implicit, and modal discontinuities. And he argued that the use of these kinds of discontinuities in aesthetic situations, in artworks, in literature, was evolutionarily adaptive. This was his theory of the time. He kind of changed it later on, but he thought experiencing discontinuities in these protected aesthetic situations was adaptive to human beings. And the incoherences Kincaid is talking about in terms of books like Wuthering Heights can maybe be seen as forms of implicit and internal discontinuities, which is to say violations of generic expectations set up by the culture or by the text itself. You know, the text set up certain expectations about it, whether it's going to be kind of this gothic romance, and then it transforms in parts into a comedy and other kinds of things. So there's this kind of violation of norms that are set up in the text or by the culture in which the text was written. We call these discontinuities. Anyway, there's other kinds of discontinuities present in the novel. The character of Heathcliff famously is especially rich from this perspective. A lot of discontinuity or kind of drastic change in his character. It might be fun sometime to analyze Wuthering Heights in terms of its discontinuities, but that would be a project for another day, of course. Anyway, something to think about. Are texts incoherent or not? If so, how are they incoherent? Are readers, or is the reading experience coherent or not? If so, how? How is it coherent or incoherent? These are interesting topics to think about, I think, and important both when talking about deconstruction and about kind of a traditional reader theory of the reading experience and the text. All right, well, anyway, next time I will talk about Peckham, who I've mentioned a couple times already. I'll talk about Peckham's own contributions to the limits of pluralism debate as we conclude the debate. So, thanks for listening, and have a good one.